In the spring of 2015, something happened in Great Smoky Mountains National Park that still raises many questions among campers, forest rangers, and even scientists trying to explain the strange details of the events that followed. It all began on April 10th, when visitors camping at the foot of the Roan Highlands noticed the absence of Ranger Jake Hudson, a trusted and experienced ranger who had rescued hikers lost on the slopes or stranded without warm clothing. Jake had devoted more than 20 years of his life to the protection of this marvelous area of nature, knew all the trails going into the mountains, and enjoyed the full confidence of his colleagues. Neighbors at the camp said that the night before, after an early supper, Hudson had gone on another evening round. Usually he returned by midnight if he didn't notice anything strange on the way. His rounds consisted of checking campfires, protected areas, and those who might have inadvertently strayed too far beyond the authorized boundaries. This time, however, not only did he not come to the general camp, but he didn't make contact by radio. His colleagues, accustomed to his punctuality, were alarmed, but thought that perhaps Jake had been delayed somewhere on the route by a sudden situation, for there were days when he had to help victims of slippery slopes or calm down troublemakers who played loud music at night. On the morning of April 11th, as the sun rose over the peaks, park staff still hadn't heard from Hudson. One of the rangers, Miles Douglas, became concerned before anyone else because he knew his friend's habits. He gathered a small group of 4 men, and they decided to scour the main trails where Jake could patrol. This outing began around 9 in the morning. The rangers followed a route known as the Sheddaw Brook Circle, which led along the river rapids and deep into the valley at the foot of the mountains. When they arrived, they found only traces of campfires left by campers and some crushed tin cans, but no sign of Hudson. They asked several people who had spent the night in the open near the creek, all of whom said they had not seen the ranger and that the night had been perfectly quiet. On their way back, the group of guards noticed a faint path that led to a small grove of oaks and decided to check it out as well. Soon they came upon a startling sight. Jake Hudson was sitting cross-legged behind a massive oak tree, his back almost against its trunk, as if he had accidentally sat down to rest, and then frozen in some grotesque pose. At first they thought he was unconscious, but when they came closer, it was clear. His eyes were wide open and glazed, and his features were full of genuine horror. Miles Douglas, deeply shocked by what he saw, rushed to check for a pulse, but there was no pulse. Hudson's feet were cold, his body was already beginning to stiffen, and everything suggested that he had been dead at least 4 or 5 hours. No one present could believe the reality of what was happening. Jake, always full of vigor, health-conscious, with no serious heart or blood pressure problems, had suddenly died in the prime of his life. The co-workers immediately called the sheriff and medics from the nearby town of Gatlinburg while trying not to touch anything around him. And that's when the first oddity was discovered. The rangers noticed deep scratches in the bark of the oak tree where the dead Jake had been sitting. The furrows were several meters across, stretching from the base of the trunk to the branches, sometimes reaching nearly 2 meters high. No one standing nearby could tell who they belonged to. A bear? But the tracks were not quite like bear claws. First, they were too vertical and precise, and second, the depth of the furrows, judging from some areas, was greater than the usual inhabitants of the park are capable of leaving. One can always assume that this is an echo of old damage to a tree caused by a hurricane or lightning, but in this case the scratches looked fresh, with tree sap still oozing on the bark and the chips scattered on the ground. Hardly a feral cat could have made such marks on such a sturdy oak tree. Few animals need to climb so high on a bare trunk, and cougars hadn't been seen in the Great Smoky Mountains for a long time. When the medical team arrived, Hudson's body was carefully removed and packed for transportation, and police officers began to survey the surrounding area. They noticed that a few meters away from the oak tree, there were indented footprints on the ground. Their shape was not quite human and not quite animal, resembling a strange combination of roundness and long prints that went under the moss and damp soil. The size of each print exceeded 40 centimeters in length and could remotely resemble the prints of a bare foot with 5 protruding toes. But these toes seemed longer than usual, and the arrangement looked unusual. The first thing police officers tried to assume that it could be left by tourists, but who could have such a huge foot size and at the same time deformed toes? It was decided to bring in a biologist who understands the fauna of the park, as well as a trail specialist to give their verdict. A small section of the trail was taped off, and the rangers who accompanied the staff tried to keep away curious onlookers who, having learned of the tragedy, began to flock to the scene. While experts examined the tracks, the sheriff met with the park supervisor and Hudson's closest co-workers to get more information about the deceased. All were unanimous in stating that Jake had never had a heart complaint. Moreover, he had regular medical examinations required for employees working in natural reservoirs. He was physically fit, and he certainly wouldn't go head-on into a large animal, for he knew the land well, knew the habits of all the animals in the area. A few hours later, Hudson's body was taken to the morgue of the local hospital. The results of the autopsy were shocking to his family, friends, and all who knew the deceased. The doctors diagnosed cardiac arrest without any predisposing factors. They recognized that the heart looked healthy, the coronary arteries were clear, and there were no blood clots or ruptures. The doctor who performed the autopsy noticed a strange detail. The facial expression indicated extreme fear at the time of death, as if the ranger had seen something terrifying that instantly caused his body to hyperreact. This kind of emotional overload is not often seen, especially if we are talking about a person trained and used to dangerous situations. However, medical science remains medical science. The record in the death certificate stated that the cause was a heart attack, but doctors could not explain what caused it. At the same time, the police questioned the tourists who had seen Hudson the day before. One of them, an elderly man named James Murphy, said that around 9 p.m., while he was sitting by the campfire, the ranger passed by and seemed a little tense. To the simple greeting question, "Is everything all right?" Jake seemed to nod, but according to Murphy, he had the look of someone looking for something or worrying about something. Murphy said he didn't think much of it, thinking the ranger was looking for bears or to see if the campers had started a fire in the wrong place. Nothing else suspicious happened. The next morning, the old hiker learned of Hudson's death and was shocked. In the meantime, an expert biologist whom the police had called in scrutinized the scratches found on the oak tree, as well as the mysterious marks, and made a preliminary judgment that no known species of animal in the Great Smoky Mountains would have left such deep and even furrows in the bark. He speculated that theoretically a grizzly bear could have scratched the wood like that while marking territory, but grizzlies haven't been in the region for a very long time, and even if they were mistaken about their range, the claw marks would look different. The ranger who had been working with him claimed that the prints on the ground were too large and elongated, as if they stretched from the roots of an oak tree deep into the forest. At the same time, no other clues, hair, remnants of wool, were found in the area. The most curious detail was that on the pine needles covering part of the soil, stains were noticed that seemed to resemble very small drops of saliva or liquid. They were taken for analysis, but the results, as it turned out later, did not give a clear answer either. They found proteins in the substance that were not characteristic of human saliva, but also did not match any known animal database. The report on this study remained labeled as unusual biological material. News of the ranger's strange death and the discovery of the mysterious footprints leaked to the local press, stirring up a minor sensation. Rumors varied. Some whispered about a beast man deep in the mountains. Others recalled old indigenous legends about supernatural spirits capable of scaring people to death. And more rationally minded residents speculated that it could be some rare species of large predator that survived in remote areas or migrated from other states. For the park management, such speculation became a real headache. They feared panic among tourists and decreased attendance. However, no official explanation was ever offered. The sheriff urged residents and travelers to remain calm, although he and his team continued to periodically patrol the area where Hudson was found. The next mysterious story occurred with the Yosemite Ranger. Ranger Mark Benson was considered one of the most experienced employees at the famous Yosemite Park. 15 years ago, he had joined the service after passing a rigorous selection process and demonstrating excellent training. He knew how to find safe paths in the wildest corners, navigated by the sun, stars, and the slightest signs of the forest, knew all the main trails and many unspoken routes. Among his colleagues, he had a reputation of a reliable man, ready to help at any time of the day or night. And so the news of his mysterious death in October 2019 shocked the entire park staff and regular visitors. It all started on the evening of October 12th. Mark, while on patrol in the northern part of the park, suddenly radioed in and reported hearing an unusual sound that sounded like a baby crying. In Yosemite, it's not uncommon to hear birds singing, wind rustling, even coyotes howling in the distance. But Mark Benson had never heard the sound of a baby crying before. He said the sound came from somewhere deep in the dense woods, where there were no official trails. At first, he suspected that a hiker had gotten lost with his child and was calling for help, although it was quite late in the day, and it sounded more like a single cry than the cries of several people. While the duty officer at the central office was listening to this unusual report, the connection suddenly went dead. After about 20 seconds, only indistinct static and hissing of the airwaves were heard. Assuming a technical glitch, colleagues tried to contact Mark again, but received no response. Knowing Benson's poise and careful handling of the radio, they became alarmed. When attempts to contact on the backup channel failed, the thought arose that Mark might have gotten into trouble, fallen, broken his radio, or experienced some other force majeure. On the morning of October 13, several rangers went at once to the part of the park where Benson usually made his rounds. According to the last coordinates from the patrol log, he was headed for an old trail leading to a small area overlooking the gorge. However, the search in the first week had yielded exactly no results. Any attempt to find fresh traces of Benson ended in disappointment. No prints, no torn uniform fabric, no personal effects of any kind. Rescuers and colleagues vacillated between panic and bewilderment. The area was vast, and the dense forest, rocky gorges, and many wild trails could hide anyone. But Mark knew these places, and everyone hoped he would make it out on his own, or at least make contact when he fixed his radio. Finally, on October 26th, in one of the inaccessible gorges, about 15 kilometers from the place of last contact, a group of tourists accidentally came across the body of the ranger. It was resting at the foot of a cliff, but strangely enough, without any visible external damage. It was as if the man had just laid down and fallen asleep, although there were steep rock walls all around, and falling from them usually leaves obvious injuries. The hikers called park security, and the staff soon arrived, along with police and paramedics. Mark was lying on his side with his arms slightly crossed and his face turned upwards toward the sky. It also seemed odd, to say the least, that his watch had stopped at the exact time of his disappearance, October 12th, 7:47 p.m. Normally, a fall or a hard blow would damage it, but here there was nothing to indicate a blow. The glass was intact, the strap was not torn off, the dial was not broken. The very stopping of the watch at the moment of its disappearance looked almost symbolic, as if someone or something had deliberately interrupted the time. The medical examination brought even more questions. The body had no fatal fractures or major wounds. Small scratches on the hands could be explained by walking in the woods, and quite carefully. No hemorrhages, signs of suffocation, gunshot, or knife wounds were found by the experts. The initial conclusion is that the cause of death is unclear, and there are no visible injuries. The doctor added that there was no water in the lungs, and the blood showed no toxins or poisons. Mark looked like his heart had just stopped suddenly. When colleagues learned that the body had been found at the bottom of a ravine 15 kilometers from the last communication point, everyone was stunned. Could he really have traveled that distance without radio communication, virtually unnoticed by other rangers and numerous hikers? There was no well-traveled trail around, and the terrain was considered dangerous. Cliffs, scree, boulders. Even a well-prepared person would need time and a lot of energy to wander there. Some noted that crossing 15 kilometers of this type of terrain in a couple of hours seemed almost impossible, unless Mark was running at a rapid spurt. But why? Who or what was he running from? Replaying the events bit by bit, the colleagues tried to figure out what might have happened after the ranger heard that very baby cry. Maybe he rushed toward the sounds, believing that somewhere in the woods, a child had wandered off and completely lost his bearings. But for a man with 15 years of experience, getting lost in Yosemite seemed unreal. Anyone who had been on the mountain trails with him at least once remembered that Mark memorized turns and landmarks on the level of reflex, and if he'd been injured, he'd probably tried to signal. There was no sign that he'd been dragged by force, And who would drag a grown, strong man more than 15 kilometers across rugged terrain unnoticed? Some people thought that he could have fallen from the upper edge of the gorge, but the expert examination did not confirm such injuries, typical for a multi-meter fall. Usually such falls break bones and cause internal lacerations, but the body remained remarkably intact, as if it had been carefully placed on the grass below. But who or what could have done this? Rumors and theories instantly swept the park. Some whispered of the supernatural, citing legends of mysterious sounds in the mountains that trapped travelers. More rational minds spoke of infection or a hidden heart condition coinciding with a night out in the danger zone. Some recalled rare instances of people hearing ghostly sounds resembling cries in the most unexpected places. Perhaps it was some sort of natural anomaly, a draft passing through a crevice in the mountains and creating an acoustic effect. But it's still unclear why the clock stopped at that very minute, and Mark found himself in the gorge so suddenly and without a trace. The park management, faced with many questions from the press and visitors, tried to give an official, albeit very dry statement. It said that Ranger Mark Benson was killed in an accident, the circumstances of which are still not fully established. Mention of a possible baby cry was not included in the public record, although colleagues knew that this was the sound he had described over the radio just moments before the communications disappeared. Upon investigating the spot where the body was found, police noticed that the gorge slope itself is relatively gentle. It is possible to descend there if you know the right way down, but there is still danger. No equipment that Mark normally carried, such as sturdy trekking poles, was found nearby. His backpack, where he might have kept his first aid kit, flashlight, and extra radio, was also missing. The medics conducted additional tests, and the medical examiner left a final note. The cause of death cannot be determined with absolute certainty. This meant that it was as if Mark's body had shut down spontaneously, with no apparent physiological preconditions. According to his friends' descriptions, he had never complained of heart problems. On the contrary, he practiced running and climbing and always checked his health. And since there was no direct evidence of the crime, the investigation dragged on, but no new leads appeared. Soon there were no loud sensations, although on the internet, some users began to vigorously discuss the version of paranormal intervention. Several tourists wrote in social networks that earlier they had also heard similar sounds remotely resembling children's crying, but decided that it was either the wind or the play of echoes in the rocks. In response, others explained that there was no evidence of anything supernatural in Yosemite. However, interest in the tragedy has waned in part because most people don't like to think long and hard about mysterious disappearances, especially when it happened in such a famous and beautiful natural place. Mark's entourage, co-workers, and family took a long time to come to their senses. They respected and loved him, and it was a hard loss for them. Nothing was found on Benson's personal belongings that were left in his office among notes and maps to indicate any concerns or fears related to the park. On the contrary, one of the notebooks contained a list of ideas for trail improvements that Mark wanted to propose to management. To this day, no one can say with certainty why Mark Benson ended up in that gorge or what actually happened to him that fateful evening. Perhaps in the future, a new clue or circumstance will be found that will shed light on the last minutes of his life. But for now, this story remains a dark mystery. An experienced ranger is found far from the scene of his disappearance, without a scratch, and his watch is forever frozen the very minute he made contact and reported hearing an unexplained child crying deep in the woods. What really happened to these rangers? We may never know the truth, but one thing is certain. There is something mysterious and dangerous lurking deep within these famous parks that is still keeping researchers and locals busy. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to share your theories in the comments. Take care and remember, sometimes the beauty of nature hides inexplicable horror.
When 32-year-old Ethan Cole disappeared on Black Hollow Ridge, all that remained behind him were his strangely arranged belongings and an eerie silence. He vanished into the fog and never returned. He was presumed dead, and memories of him gradually faded. Then, 7 years later, he reappeared, alive. But he wasn't the same man he had been before. His story instantly became a national sensation. A man presumed dead had returned out of the blue. emaciated and silent, as if carried by the wind from another world. What had happened to him? Where had he been all these years? And why had no one been able to find him? In late August, on a morning shrouded in thick, milky fog, Ethan arrived at the Black Hollow Ridge Trail, a wild area on the edge of the reserve known for its steep slopes, unstable weather, and rocky ridges. The place had a bad reputation, and tourists gave it a wide berth. But Ethan wasn't like that. He loved solo hiking and thrived on the thrill of danger. The harsh landscapes didn't scare him. They challenged him. He carefully packed his backpack: a water filter, a first aid kit, thick socks, a lightweight tent, provisions, a change of clothes, and a GPS. A pair of sturdy boots with worn soles and a pair of trusty trekking poles completed the kit. Before setting off, he called his sister Claire. "I'm at the trailhead. Everything's fine. I'll call you in the evening." "Dad asked for a photo when you get there," she said anxiously. "I will. I love you," Ethan replied and hung up. He set off alone, as he liked to do. The grass crunched under his feet, scattered light filtered through the trees, and fog hung over the mountains. But after a few hours, he sensed that something was wrong with this hike. At first, there was silence. Not just the absence of sound, but an oppressive, viscous emptiness. No birds sang, no crickets chirped. It seemed as if the air itself was watching him. Ethan didn't think much of it. He quickened his pace to catch up, but soon realized he was losing his bearings. Everything looked the same: foggy fir trees, slippery rocks, steep trails. When evening fell, he stopped on a hill overlooking the forest-covered hills. He took out his phone and took a photo of the panorama, hoping to send it later when he got a signal. Claire never saw that photo. The first alarm bells rang 2 days later. Claire tried to call her brother, but to no avail. His phone was out of range. On the third day, she contacted the local authorities. The search began. Helicopters combed the mountains from the air. Rangers and volunteers searched the forest. Ethan's father, Greg, went to the site himself. A week later, they found the first and only evidence of his presence: a blue backpack and walking sticks, neatly stacked on a small pile of rocks. Everything looked too clean, too neat. It was as if someone had placed it there on purpose. But there was no body, no traces, no clues, no piece of clothing, no blood stains, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed him up, and rumors began to spread. Did he fall into a crevasse? Was he attacked? Did he run away? Or was it something else? Rescuers searched for another 2 weeks, venturing deeper into the wilderness, but to no avail. Eventually, the search was called off, but the family did not give up. After the official search was called off, the Cowles family began to fight on their own. Greg sold his car to pay for a private tracker. Claire created a website and social media pages, appealing to anyone who might have been in the Black Hollow Ridge area in those days. She posted flyers in tourist centers, shops, and parking lots. Anyone who had even heard of the mountain trail was given information about the missing Ethan. A month passed, then 2. Autumn turned to winter. Snow covered the trails, and the chances of finding anything were reduced to 0. But even when others began to forget about the missing tourist, his family continued the search. In the spring, when the snow melted, they returned to the trail. Greg, Claire, and 2 volunteers. Every step was accompanied by hope and fear. They found strange little things: a torn belt, a rusty piece of tin, a worn shoelace. But none of these finds could be identified as belonging to Ethan. The area where the backpack was found was searched again, high and low. The bushes had grown tall, and the ground was overgrown with grass. But the feeling of unease, as if something was left behind, would not go away. Claire placed a small wooden cross there, sticking it into the ground with the words, "If you're still out there, find your way home, and if not, let this place be a memorial." Years passed. Public interest in the case faded. New events pushed Ethan's disappearance out of the headlines. But for the Cowles, every week, every month, became an unbearable ordeal. Diana, Ethan's mother, gradually faded away. She would wake up in the middle of the night, thinking she heard her son's footsteps on the porch. Her heart couldn't take it. In February, 4 years after his disappearance, she died of a heart attack, which the doctor's report later attributed to chronic anxiety and emotional exhaustion. That was the breaking point. At the request of the insurance company and in accordance with the law, on the 5th anniversary of his disappearance, the judge declared Ethan Cole dead. It was a painful legal act, necessary to settle accounts, debts, and property. But for Claire, it was like a knife in the back. She left the courtroom without saying a word. And then something strange happened. On the 7th anniversary of his disappearance, in the summer, Claire, her husband Daniel, and their 3-year-old son Oliver went on a picnic in a forest park outside the city. While Daniel was lighting a fire, Claire received a text message from a friend. "Claire, are you sitting down? You need to see this." The message contained a link to a photo. It showed a barefoot man with disheveled hair and faded clothes, standing at the counter of a roadside diner. His eyes were sunken. His face was tanned to a dark color, and his hands were scarred. But the look in his eyes, it was Ethan's look. Her friend worked at the diner. She wrote that the man had walked in like a ghost. He asked for water, stood there silently for a long time, not recognizing anything around him. Customers took out their phones. 10 minutes later, someone called the police. Claire handed her son to Daniel, jumped into the car, and drove off. She flew down the highway, oblivious to the road. Her heart was pounding, her palms were shaking. One question echoed in her head: is it him? By the time she arrived, the police had already taken the man to the hospital. Greg arrived there a little later. They were only allowed to see him after several hours. In the ward, under the white light of the lamps, lay a man who was both a stranger and a loved one. His eyes wandered around the room like an animal that had escaped from a cage. He flinched when Greg entered. Then he noticed Claire. He didn't speak right away. Only after a few minutes, with great difficulty, did he manage to say, "Claire?" That name seemed to strike something inside her. She couldn't take it anymore. She went over, hugged him, buried her face in his shoulder, smelling smoke, sweat, and wood. He was trembling, but not from fear, from the impossibility of believing that all this was real. But what had happened to him there, deep in Black Hollow Ridge? Why hadn't he come back sooner? Where had his voice, his face, his past gone? The answers lay ahead, and they would prove no less frightening than his disappearance itself. The first days after Ethan's return were, as the doctor said, critical. He was emaciated, dehydrated, covered in scars, with poorly healed fractures, and obvious signs of prolonged exhaustion. He hardly spoke. Flashes of light, the sound of the television, even the ringing of the phone, all of it threw him off balance. He covered himself with his hands, as if waiting for a blow. He was fed little by little. His body couldn't handle large amounts of food after so many years of survival. Psychologists were initially unable to communicate with him. He either remained silent when asked questions or looked away, as if words were foreign to him. He often stared at his palms, slowly moving his fingers as if remembering how to use them. Sometimes he just sat staring out the window with the same distant expression he had when he was first found in the diner. Claire hardly left his side. She read to him aloud, told him the news, brought him photographs. His mother, Oliver, their house, the dog they had gotten named Charlie. He nodded sometimes, but his gaze remained empty. It wasn't until the 3rd day that he whispered, "Charlie, barking dog," and for a moment his lips twitched into something like a smile. It was their first real contact. It took Ethan almost 2 weeks to start talking. His speech was uneven and fragmented, like someone who was relearning how to connect sounds into sentences. He had trouble remembering things. His memories were like blurry frames, a rock falling from the ridge, a sharp pain in his shoulder, the ground disappearing from under his feet. "I fell," he said one evening, barely audibly. I don't know how far. Everything was white and gray, rocks. I couldn't move. Then there was water. I crawled. He remembered how he spent the first week with a broken leg, immobilized and lost. He ate leaves and drank rainwater. When the pain became bearable, he made a splint out of branches and began to walk along the stream, hoping for help. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know which way was up or down. He saw helicopters, but they didn't see him. I screamed, but my voice, it disappeared. He described how he built primitive traps, ate insects, and boiled roots and herbs in an old pot he found in a ruined hut. He didn't know whose house it was, a hunter's, a tourist's, but there was a knife, a pot, and a blanket eaten by moths. The hut saved him from the cold and rain. He hid there from animals and whispered fairy tales to himself at night to keep from going mad with loneliness. I heard footsteps. Someone walked by once, but I was afraid to go out. He said he was sure that at some point he began to lose his mind. Voices talked to him. He saw shadows in the forest. Sometimes he felt that someone was watching him, standing behind the trees. He knew it could be hallucinations, but the fear was real. At some point, I stopped counting the days. I just lived like an animal. I walked in circles. I hunted. I hid. I waited. One day he woke up with the feeling that he had to go. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe the sound of the stream had grown louder. He left the hut and walked along the water for several days. He hardly ate. He felt like he was dying. And then he came to the road. A farmer passing by picked him up, not recognizing him. He took him to the city. The rest is history. And even though he returned, there was something unfinished about him. Claire saw him sitting on the porch, staring at the trees. She saw how he couldn't watch the news, how he was afraid of crowds. He never slept with the door closed. He ate slowly, cautiously, saving some of his food for later. Greg couldn't find common ground with him either. They were close, but it was as if there was a glass wall between them. He tried to joke, brought him newspapers, suggested they go for a walk together, but Ethan didn't laugh. He hardly ever smiled, only sometimes when Oliver took his hand. Ethan didn't ask about his mother. He understood, and when he did, he cried. Quietly, without a sound, turning away to the wall. He didn't say a word for several days. The doctor said, "It's survivor's trauma. He blames himself for staying alive and not being there when his mother died." Weeks passed. Claire sometimes felt afraid that this man wasn't really her brother, that the forest had changed him. That part of his soul had been left behind, among the moss and the wind. He began to leave the house. In the mornings, he would walk alone on the outskirts of town. Sometimes he would sit by the stream and just stare at the water, as if looking for a way back. It took almost 6 months for Ethan Cole to start participating in life. Not the one he once belonged to, but a new one. Cautious, as if stretched on a thin line between the past and the present. He couldn't go back to his old self. That was clear to everyone. He didn't watch movies, use his phone, or go to the supermarket, but he started listening, carefully, intently. He didn't just hear, he absorbed every word, especially from people who talked about loss, about fear, about pain. These feelings were closest to him. Claire suggested he go to a survival center where teenagers were taught the basics of camping. A former military man and friend of the family taught there. Ethan refused at first. Then 2 days later, he asked to be taken there. Not as a lecturer, as a listener. He sat down by the fire while the instructor explained how to start a fire without matches. No one recognized him as Ethan Cole, the man who came back from the dead, as the newspapers had written. He looked different, calm, even modest. But when one of the teenagers asked, "What should you do if you're alone in the forest?" Ethan looked up. "The main thing is not to start talking to the trees," he said quietly. "But if you do, listen to what they say." Everyone laughed, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. It was small, barely noticeable, but real. From that moment on, he began to appear there more and more often, not as an instructor, as a living example. He didn't talk about the details of his survival. He didn't mention hunger, hallucinations, or the fear of dying alone. He only talked about discipline, about how important it was to keep moving, how not to lose faith in salvation, even when the sky is silent. Over time, he began to be invited to tourist club meetings. He refused interviews. He didn't want cameras. He said, "I didn't come back to be a symbol. I came back because I didn't give up." Claire sometimes watched him from afar. She watched him play with her son, building forts in the yard and showing him how to recognize animal tracks. He wasn't the same brother she had known, but he was alive, and he was there. Greg, in turn, tried to fill the silence between them with chores. He fixed the car, painted the fence, brought out old photo albums. He didn't ask any more questions. He just sat there while Ethan silently cleaned fish or read books about the forest. Once he said, "I don't know what you've been through, but you're here. That's enough." And yet there were moments when Ethan withdrew into himself. At night, in the rain, when the wind picked up, he couldn't sleep in complete silence. He left the radio on, even if there was only static. He was tormented by dreams. Sometimes he screamed, sometimes he cried. Once he whispered, "She was calling me." "Mom." I heard her in the wind. The psychologist explained it as deep trauma bordering on psychosis. But Claire didn't argue. She knew it wasn't medicine that saved him. It was his stubbornness, endurance, and memory. In the spring, he erected a new cross where his backpack and sticks had been found. He spent several days carving it by hand. On the board, he burned a single word: home. He stood there alone for a long time until the sun disappeared behind the treetops. He didn't pray. He just stared into the forest where he had spent 7 years of his life. Then he turned and walked down the path, steadily and confidently, one step at a time. Ethan Cole's story spread throughout the region. Some believed it, some doubted it. There were even those who claimed he had staged the whole thing, but his family knew he couldn't have made it up. The scars were real. His eyes were the same ones that had seen the night, the loneliness, and the pain. Now Ethan isn't looking for fame. He lives quietly in his father's house. He helps local volunteers, goes hiking with children, and repairs old route maps. He hasn't forgotten what it means to disappear. And so, to everyone who enters the forest, he says one thing: make sure someone knows where you are, and remember, there is a way back, even if it doesn't start with a trail, but with hope. Could you have survived like Ethan? Do you believe his story? Tell us in the comments, and we'll see you in the next episode. In the spring of 2017, a mysterious story unfolded in the Olympic National Park in Washington state, stirring the minds of rangers, journalists, and local residents for a long time. 22-year-old Jacob Gray, a native of California, disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only his bicycle with a trailer and some gear. His disappearance raised a barrage of questions. Why did no one see him leave the campsite? And why were some of his belongings scattered in such an illogical manner? Even more mysterious was the fact that more than a year later, his remains were found high in the mountains, at a location far from where his bicycle had been found. Many are still left wondering how a young man who was well prepared for the conditions of the trip could have ended up in such a remote area and met such a tragic end. Jacob Gray was born and raised in Santa Cruz, California, where he developed a passion for travel and outdoor sports from an early age. According to his family and friends, he was an inquisitive person with a thirst for discovery. At the age of 15, he became fascinated with cycling, and when he came of age, he began planning routes for longer trips. When he turned 22, Jacob decided to embark on a great adventure, to travel across Washington state with the intention of reaching the vast Daniel J. Evans Wilderness area in the heart of Olympic National Park, and then move east, possibly toward other states. According to his family, on the eve of his departure, he spoke of his burning desire to live simply and close to nature. He took with him a bicycle with a small trailer filled with camping equipment, a tent, a sleeping bag, food supplies, some hunting and fishing gear, and a bow and arrows so he could hunt. Some people wondered why he needed a bow, but Jacob assured them that it was part of his plan to blend in with his surroundings as much as possible and not depend on shops or civilization. In early April 2017, he was seen in the town of Port Townsend, where he was making his last purchases and checking his route. On April 5th, he set out alone, clearly determined to cover the long distance. No one could have imagined that the very next day, the search for this young man would become one of those mysteries that would not be quickly solved. On the morning of April 6, 2017, rangers from Olympic National Park discovered a strange scene about 6.5 miles down the Solduck Hot Springs Road. Part of some gear was lying in the trailer. It looked like camping equipment, and a bow and several arrows were found sticking out of the back of the trailer and lying around. It looked as if the owner had left his vehicle in a hurry, but for what reason and where he had gone was unknown. The first person to see the abandoned bike was a ranger named John Bowie. He figured the cyclist might have gone to a nearby river to get some water and accidentally fallen in. The water, especially in spring, was freezing, and anyone who couldn't get out could freeze or drown. Or, Bowie thought, the owner of the bike had decided to hitch a ride to the hot springs and would be back soon. That same day, Bowie contacted his colleague, Officer Brian Ray, and asked him to return there the next day to double-check the situation and make sure the bike hadn't been stolen or deliberately discarded. However, by April 8th, nothing had changed. The bike and trailer were still there. The absence of the owner suggested that something had happened. The rangers found no note, no signs of a struggle, and no clues as to where the cyclist might have gone. A rather grim picture began to emerge. A young man had disappeared almost overnight. When it became clear that the owner of the bike, a certain Jacob Gray, had simply vanished, the National Park Service teamed up with local police to launch a search operation. The initial theory was that Gray might have fallen into the water or been injured. Given his equipment, a bow, arrows, and a tent, it was also possible that he had gone deep into the forest to hunt or explore and, for some reason, was unable to return. However, an extensive search involving ground crews, dog handlers, and even helicopter support yielded no results. The area around the Solduck River was thoroughly searched, but no one found Gray's body or any of his belongings. The murky waters of the spring flood could have hidden evidence, and helicopter flyovers also failed to shed any light on the matter. In addition, the landscape was quite complex. Dense forests, hills, and bodies of water, rather than tropical terrain where traces are more obvious. As a result, the search teams were left with no leads or clues that could shed light on Jacob's fate. Soon, interest in the case grew. Local newspapers and online publications mentioned the young traveler who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. A dreamer and traveler who left on a bicycle disappeared in the heart of Olympic. Some people thought that Gray had left his bike behind on purpose, deciding to go deep into the wilderness to live as a hermit. But experience showed that people usually leave a note or tell their friends about plans like that. None of Gray's friends remembered him talking about wanting to disappear completely. On the contrary, he simply wanted to go on a trip away from the busy roads, but did not want to cut off all contact with people. Despite all efforts, the case of Jacob Gray gradually became a cold case. Investigators could not keep search parties in the park forever. The missing man's relatives, particularly his father, made independent trips to the area, distributed flyers, and talked to tourists, hoping to get at least a scrap of new information. But all was in vain. Occasionally, rumors would surface that someone had seen a man who looked like Jacob Gray wandering mysteriously along a trail or highway, but these reports were always proven to be false alarms. The Gray family could not accept the idea that their energetic young traveler had simply vanished into one of Washington state's most popular parks. By that point, They understood that the hope of finding him alive was fading, but without confirmation of his death, the question remained, what if he was still alive somewhere, having lost his memory or deliberately hiding? But in the end, the summer of 2018 brought an answer, a terrible and unexpected one. On August 10, 2018, more than a year after Jacob's disappearance, clothing and human remains were found in Olympic National Park in the area around Lake Ho. This area is located at an elevation of approximately 5,300 feet, about 1,650 meters above sea level. The distance from the place where Gray's bicycle was found on the Salduck Hot Springs Road to this point is at least 15 miles, with much of the route passing through steep slopes, forest thickets, and mountainous terrain. These slopes are quite inaccessible and not frequented by ordinary tourists walking in the park. Experts who arrived at the scene found signs that a human body had been lying there for quite some time. Some personal belongings were found nearby, a piece of clothing, possibly a fragment of a knife, and some items resembling camping equipment. When park officers and police conducted an initial identification, there were serious grounds to believe that this was the missing Jacob Gray. A more accurate identification was made through DNA analysis. The information obtained during the investigation confirmed the worst fears. The remains did indeed belong to Jacob. The public was stunned. How could a man who left his bike and trailer in one place have traveled 15 miles further and even climbed high up, considering that the weather was unfavorable and rain or cold could have made it difficult? He probably decided to continue on foot, leaving his bike behind due to some kind of breakdown or other force majeure. But why didn't he take at least some provisions with him? And most importantly, what caused his death? While investigating the site where the remains were found, investigators tried to reconstruct Jacob's last days and hours, putting forward various hypotheses. One of them was that he may have overestimated his own strength and, having decided to climb to the ridge, encountered a sudden deterioration in the weather. In spring, temperature and precipitation changes are common in the mountains, so without sufficient experience or equipment, he could easily have found himself in a critical situation, got lost, become exhausted, and, unable to call for help, died. Another version suggested that Jacob could have been injured, for example, sprained or broken a bone while climbing the rocks, and then found himself without a means of communication and unable to descend on his own. Death from hypothermia was also not ruled out. In high mountains covered with spring snowfields, a tourist without appropriate clothing quickly becomes hypothermic, sometimes becomes disoriented, loses the ability to act rationally, and, unable to warm up, dies. Some spoke of a conscious choice of solitude. Perhaps Jacob went deeper into the wilderness in search of a spiritual challenge, but it is unclear why he abandoned his bicycle and trailer with provisions, since a long stay in solitude requires a supply of resources. Finally, although no signs of a struggle or violence were found, an extremely unlikely version was discussed, namely that Jacob met strangers in the mountains and got into a conflict, but no evidence was found to support this theory. In the end, the official position was that for unknown reasons, he left his vehicle and went into the mountains, where he died as a result of several unfavorable factors: injury, hypothermia, exhaustion, and his remains underwent natural decomposition and exposure to the elements, leaving no direct clues about the final moments of his life. Upon learning of the discovery, Gray's family experienced mixed feelings: grief over the confirmed death of their son, but also a sense of relief that the months of uncertainty were over and they could finally lay his remains to rest. Jacob's father, Randy, was actively involved in the search for his son from the very beginning. He repeatedly visited the police station and went out on the trails himself, sometimes risking his own health, just to get any information. When news came that human remains had been found in the Lake Ho area, Randy was one of the first to want to get there to see for himself. However, investigation rules and the dangerous mountain terrain prevented him from going right away. Randy eventually got permission to go, after the forensic team finished their work at the site. According to his father, Jacob had always been determined. He is convinced that his son may have decided to take the long route in order to avoid certain obstacles on the road, or that he wanted to explore the mountainous area in the hope of shortening his journey or reaching a plateau from where he could cross over to other trails. Perhaps he was caught in a snowstorm, which is not uncommon in the high mountains even in spring, and was unable to return. No one will ever know the exact cause, as time has erased almost all traces. Doubts and unresolved details still trouble the minds of those who were interested in Jacob's disappearance. First of all, it is unclear why he chose that particular corner of the wilderness, which was not on the logical route to the nearest settlement. After all, if he had wanted to, he could have returned to Salduck Hot Springs Road and continued along more convenient trails. Instead, Jacob apparently headed for the impassable heights, as if deliberately fleeing civilization. Equally puzzling is the fact that he left most of his equipment, his bicycle, trailer, and some of his provisions, untouched. Some suggest that the bike broke down, or the chain came off, but if he knew he would have to walk, why didn't he take at least a minimal supply of food with him? Even stranger is the position of the bow and arrows. Why were they removed and scattered around the trailer? Either he was urgently looking for something, or he was frightened by something related to the nighttime incident. Since mobile communication is either non-existent or unstable in the mountains, Jacob may have been relying on a radio or satellite tracker, but nothing of the sort was found. In the northwestern United States, legends of a massive humanoid creature inhabiting the remote forests have been circulating for decades. They say that Sasquatch is distinguished not only by its impressive strength and ability to move silently along overgrown trails, but also by its strange behavior. It can watch tourists from a hidden spot, build strange structures out of branches, or leave deep footprints that abruptly end on solid ground. Some enthusiasts explain the Bigfoot version of Gray's case as follows. At night, when Jacob first arrived at the Salduck River, he may have noticed or heard something suspicious around the camp. Perhaps these were the same wheezing or characteristic knocks that, according to legend, Sasquatch makes by tapping on tree trunks. In a panic or out of intense curiosity, Jacob grabbed his bow and began to prepare for defense. Hence the arrows pulled out and scattered, as if he had hurried to check or load them. Next, according to supporters of this version, an encounter occurred that frightened Gray so much that he urgently left the place, leaving behind almost all of his equipment. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain why he did not take any provisions or even water. It was as if he was driven by one goal, to get as far away as possible from what he had seen. Perhaps he thought that there was a secluded path in the mountains where the creature, if it really existed, would not follow him. Of course, there is no concrete evidence for this hypothesis. No huge footprints or scraps of unknown fur were ever found at the scene. But in the archives of cryptozoology enthusiasts, you can find dozens of stories from people who fled from a hairy shadow that suddenly appeared nearby. Some groups of researchers recall incidents in the same area of Olympic Park, where tourists heard loud howls and found broken trees on the trail. The Sasquatch version seems romantic and scary at the same time, but there is a psychological grain of truth in it. A person, faced with something inexplicable and somewhat frightening, could indeed have dropped almost all of their belongings and fled into the mountains. The approaching night, cold, and panic only exacerbated their situation. Alas, if this mysterious creature does exist in nature, it never leaves any clear clues behind, which is why official reports make no mention of anything like this. But such stories arise where logic fails to provide clear answers, and the disappearance of Jacob Gray easily fuels such speculation about a hidden inhabitant of the forest wilderness. The story of Jacob Gray reminds us how unpredictable and sometimes ruthless nature can be, even for a person with a certain amount of experience and a desire to live in harmony with the wild. It is quite possible that ordinary factors played a role here: weather, lack of resources, carelessness. However, romantic and frightening rumors about Bigfoot or unknown forces continue to swirl around this tragedy, showing that the mysteries born in the depths of the northwestern forests do not always have a clear explanation. That's all. Thank you for listening to this story, and if you found it interesting, please like it or share your thoughts in the comments. They were from different countries and didn't know each other. One was a British man with a compass and a map, another was a tourist from New Zealand, and 5 were students from Medellin. They all went into the tropical forests of South America and never came back. They were found weeks later, exhausted, with broken bones, near the water they never found. Diaries, charred branches, bandages on trees. Everything pointed to the fact that they fought until the end. But the main thing about these stories is that they're unexplainable. Why did experienced people lose their way? Why did the GPS die on the third day? Why could they hear water but not reach it? These deaths are officially recognized as accidents. But when you read their last entries, you realize that something is wrong in these jungles. In this episode, you will hear 3 crazy but similar stories about the mysterious deaths of tourists in the jungle under inexplicable circumstances. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a comment. In July 1999, 27-year-old British citizen Thomas Rain, registered in London as a tourist visa holder, arrived in Brazil. On his border control form, he stated the purpose of his visit as a hiking trip through the sparsely populated regions of the Amazon. His arrival was recorded at the international airport in Manaus. 2 days later, he took a domestic flight to Tabatinga, located on the border with Peru and Colombia. According to immigration records and a hotel register, he spent one night in Tabatinga before traveling northeast along the Jutai River. The last person to speak with him in person was Luis Almeida, the owner of a fishing boat. He claimed to have dropped Tom Rain off on a remote shore an hour after dawn. There, a trail began that led to an old, now unused route, once laid out by geologists. The area was not a tourist destination. There was no regular communication. The official itinerary Tom left on the hotel desk included a 10-day route with a return trip to the village of São José de Jutaia. He didn't tell anyone else about his plans except the boat owner. There were no plans for satellite communication, and the equipment, according to the description, included only a map, a compass, a machete, tent fabric, food for 5 days, and a diary. 3 days after setting off, Tom Rain stopped communicating. He had unofficially promised to write a letter or send a postcard upon arrival at the next settlement. None of the locals saw him there. 2 weeks later, Rain's father reported him missing. Only a month later, his diary was found by fishermen on the banks of the Jutaia River. It was partially wet but legible. The last few entries raised questions. Entry from the 7th day of the trip. The compass isn't working. The needle is floating. The magnet is reacting strangely. It feels like the sun isn't shining where it should. Entry from the 8th day. I see a trail and follow it, but after an hour it disappears. There are no traces. Everything is the same. Vines, trees, mold, dampness. Every night I hear water, but I can't find it. I'm getting weaker. I drink from leaves and eat bugs. I lost my boot. In the 4th week after his disappearance, a group of volunteers made up of local hunters, explorers, and a police officer began combing the area marked as his presumed route. The search was complicated by the dense forest, high humidity, and lack of landmarks. 6 weeks after his disappearance, Tom Rain's body was found under the roots of a fallen tree in a swampy wooded area 5 kilometers from the presumed route. He was lying on his back, partially covered by branches. He was wearing one shoe. The other was missing. His only clothing was a pair of trousers and a torn shirt. There were traces of skin ulcers on his feet. His back and lower back showed signs of scratching and inflammation. His left wrist was wrapped in a piece of cloth, probably to stop the bleeding. Dried berries were found in his pocket. A forensic examination conducted in Manaus established that death was caused by exhaustion, dehydration, and infectious tissue damage against a background of general weakness. The estimated survival time was at least 19 days after the last contact. No signs of external violence were found. There were also no traces of predators. Fingerprints confirmed the identity. The body was handed over to relatives 3 weeks after its arrival in the capital. At the site where the diary was found, experts discovered his backpack. Inside were an empty flask, a broken compass, a box of fishing hooks, tweezers, a cord, a toothbrush, and scraps of tent fabric. The notebook had been torn from its cover. All of the items were scattered within a 3-meter radius. Neither the diary nor the police reports mention any traces of wild animals nearby. However, some researchers have noted indirect signs of disorientation, which is unusual for someone with hiking experience. In particular, compass failure, inability to navigate by the sun, and the sensation of hearing water but not being able to locate the source. This is observed in some forms of psychophysiological exhaustion or when exposed to external ultra-low frequency noise. However, no natural geomagnetic anomalies or recorded sources of infrasound were found in the area. It should also be noted that, according to the Ticuna Indians, there are places in this region that even hunters are advised not to visit. These areas, according to them, are characterized by all-consuming silence, loss of direction, and a feeling of alien presence. Officially, this information is not considered legally binding. No signs of a struggle, traces of blood, or foreign interference on the body were found. However, the fact that the diary was found several kilometers away from the body and the backpack was partially dismantled raises questions. It is also inexplicable why, during his nearly 20 days of survival, Rain never reached the river, even though, according to the map, there were at least 2 streams within a 2-kilometer radius. He wrote that he heard water but could not find it. This feature appears as one of the signs of acute exhaustion and cognitive breakdown, but, according to one expert, it could also have been the result of unusual acoustic distortion in the jungle. Based on the surviving records and analysis of his physical condition, an approximate picture of Tom Ron's survival from the 7th to the 26th day after entering the jungle has been reconstructed. His condition deteriorated rapidly. At first, he tried to stick to the route, noting in his diary that he was walking 2 to 3 miles every day. However, after a week, his notes became disjointed, describing disorientation and unstable sleep. On the 8th day, he noted that chills began at night, and in the morning, his toes were like wood. He describes how he struggled to get up, putting leaves under his feet because my boots were wet, and the second one was sucked into the swamp. Due to the constant dampness, his feet began to become inflamed. It was probably then that the first ulcers appeared on his feet. From the 9th day onwards, he fed exclusively on whatever he could find: yellow berries with a bitter taste, larvae, beetles, and crushed leaves. Twice in his diary, he mentions that he tried to catch a frog, but it melted into the mud. According to his descriptions, he was unable to build a fire during this entire time. By the 11th day, he began to have convulsions. He writes, "Woke up in the mud. My leg was twitching. A bite on my thigh, not a snake. A blue spot. Scratched it for a long time. Then I tore it out." According to the pathologist's report, there were indeed parasitic bites on the body, insect marks, ulcerative lesions on the left shin, and a purulent focus on the back of the thigh. In jungle conditions, such an infection could quickly lead to fever and hallucinations. From the 12th to the 15th day, the entries become less clear. He writes that he can no longer tell morning from night, and that time passes, but he always returns to the same place. Experts noted the unusual acoustic situation described by Reen. He regularly heard the sound of water but could not find the source. This is possible in the dense jungle and humid air. But if a person goes without sleep and proper food for a long time, their hearing becomes distorted. He could have been following the sound of a stream reflected by dozens of obstacles in the wrong direction, moving further and further away from the water. On the 15th day, he wrote, "I have no tongue. I have no taste. I drink what drips. When I breathe, it's as if someone is repeating it behind me. It may be noise, but I wait for it to pass. Then I move." At this stage, according to medical experts, he probably began to experience cognitive disorders, loss of temporal orientation, auditory hallucinations, and obsessive fears. However, even in this state, he continued to record his thoughts, which indicates a strong mind. On the 16th day, he began to take apart his clothes. He tore off a piece of fabric and wrapped it around his left leg. According to his notes, the wound started to stink. The flesh is soft. Tied it with a rag. Lay down and can't get up. 2 days later, the last clear entry. I heard something big. The tree trunk was swaying, or the air was humming. I lay back down. I'm waiting for the light. I'm cold, even though it's hot. The body was found almost 4 weeks after the presumed date of death. It was lying under the roots of a fallen tree. Experts believe that he may have crawled there himself in search of shelter from the rain or heat. Such behavior is typical of people in the extreme phase of exhaustion. They seek a limited, safe space. However, some details remain unexplained. First, the diary and backpack were found a considerable distance from the body. At least 4 days could have passed between the last entry and death. It is unclear why he left his belongings behind. There is no mention in the diary of any intention to leave his equipment. Second, the absence of traces of predators is rare in such an environment. Neither insects, scavengers, nor predators touched the body. One of the hunters who participated in the search said that he had never seen a body lie there for so long and remain almost untouched. Third, the fact that an experienced hiker with many years of experience lost his way and, in 18 days, did not find a source of water in an area where there is at least one stream every 2 kilometers raises questions. None of these circumstances point directly to anything mystical, but they create an atmosphere of disturbing isolation, as if the environment did not obey the usual laws of navigation. After Tom Rain's body and backpack were found, Amazonas State Police, representatives of the British consulate, as well as Brazilian doctors, pathologists, and investigators were called in. Their task was to establish the exact cause of death, the conditions in which the man found himself, and the possible presence of outside interference. According to the official report published 2 months after the autopsy, the cause of Tom Rowe's death was a combination of acute exhaustion, dehydration, and a bacterial infection that entered through an open wound on his left leg. Death occurred between the 18th and 23rd day of his stay in the jungle, from the moment he left the route. The physical condition of the body corresponded to the symptoms described: extreme emaciation, signs of infectious disease, ulcers, soft tissue edema, and inflammation. No signs of violent death, including traces of struggle or exposure to cold weapons, were found. No large animal bites were found on the body, which was also noted in the experts' reports. The type of clothing and the location of the backpack confirmed that Tom had moved around very little in his final days. He probably spent most of his time crawling or moving around with the help of tree roots, conserving his remaining strength. There were almost no traces of his final route to the tree where he was found due to heavy rainfall and loose soil. The place where the body was found has no clearly defined trails and is marked on maps as a swampy area with difficult terrain. During the rainy season, it is even more isolated. However, according to geologists, 2 kilometers down the slope there is a permanent stream, the water level of which did not fall below 30 centimeters even during droughts. Why Tom did not reach it remains unclear. In his diary, he regularly mentions the sound of water, but says he cannot find it. This discrepancy has become one of the most discussed points. According to the conclusion of forensic psychiatrist Renato Mireles, in the final stages, Rain may have been in a state of disorientation caused by exhaustion, dehydration, and infection. According to the expert, this condition could have led to auditory hallucinations, impaired movement logic, and destructive decisions, including abandoning his backpack and changing direction. Although the case is officially closed, independent researchers and enthusiasts continue to discuss the case of Tom Rain. Some note that over the past 20 years, 6 disappearances of solo travelers have been recorded in the Amazon region, between Tefe and Quarry, including a photographer from Canada and 2 documentary filmmakers from Argentina. In none of these cases has it been possible to completely reconstruct the route taken by the individuals. The causes were often cited as disorientation, weather conditions, or injuries. However, as in the case of Ray, there were no signs of violence or animal tracks, and the bodies, if found, were located in unusual, secluded places. In early July 2015, a group of 5 biology students from the University of Antioquia in Medellin flew to southern Colombia to take part in a field expedition. Their task was to study the biodiversity of flora and fauna in a remote part of the Amazon region near the border with Ecuador, in the municipality of Puerto Asunción, Putumayo Department. The group included Alejandro Mesa, 24 years old, Camilo Torres, 22 years old, Silvia Mora, 25 years old, Fernando Rueda, 23 years old, and Paula Cordoba, 24 years old. All participants had previous experience of expeditions to forest areas, but the conditions in Putumayo were considered more difficult. They hired a local guide named Esteban Calderon, who lived in the village of La Tagua, to accompany them. Esteban had previously worked with other university groups and knew the local trails. The expedition started on July 3rd. An 8-day route was planned along a previously agreed track along the eastern tributary of the Guayabino River. The group had minimal equipment: tents, light backpacks, 10 days' worth of food, 1 satellite phone, and a paper map of the route, laminated and attached to the guide. They also had a portable GPS navigator and a first aid kit. Everything went according to plan until the 6th day of the journey, July 8th. According to reports received the previous evening, the group stopped at a stream near the point marked as the Tres Palmas sector. The last signal was received from Esteban's device at 7:40 p.m. Communication ceased on July 9th. According to the survivors, on the night of July 8th to 9, while crossing one of the narrow tributaries, Esteban slipped on wet roots and fell into the water. The current was strong due to recent rains. He was swept away, along with his backpack, which contained a map, a satellite phone, and some food. They called out to him but heard no response. They were unable to find him at dawn. The others panicked. Without a map or communication, the group decided not to continue on their way, but to return, relying on their memory and GPS, which soon ran out of power. Silvia Mora later reported that after an argument about the direction to take, Camilo Torres left alone, promising to return by evening. He did not return. It was impossible to search for him in the dark. With each passing day, the situation worsened. Food was limited to mushrooms found under tree roots and fruits that not everyone was sure were edible. One of them, Fernando Rueda, cut his leg while trying to get through an area with sharp bamboo. Without proper disinfection, the wound became infected. 6 days later, he fell into a delirium and died during the night. After Fernando's death, the group completely lost coordination. Silvia Mora later wrote in a medical report that at that point, she began to experience episodes of disorientation due to dehydration, constant humidity, and lack of sleep. Paula Cordoba suffered from a sharp drop in blood pressure and lost the ability to walk on the 3rd day after Fernando's death. They tried to build a shelter out of branches, but every evening it rained heavily, and they woke up in water. On the 12th day after losing their guide, they ran out of food. They could no longer search for mushrooms because Paula was unable to move, and Alejandro and Silvia were afraid to leave her alone. They had to drink from drops that had collected on leaves and from shallow puddles where the water had a green tint. Silvia began vomiting. Paula lost consciousness. On July 15th, Alejandro decided to go alone to find water or signal. He returned in the evening with a cut-open plastic bag filled with muddy water. By then, Paula was unconscious. She died during the night of July 15th, 16. The remaining 2, Silvia and Alejandro, spent the next 5 days wandering around. They moved slowly, trying to keep going in the same direction. Silvia developed an infection in her mouth. Alejandro hardly spoke all day, conserving his strength. Sometimes they heard the sound of an engine in the distance, but they couldn't tell where it was coming from. It was not until July 28th that they reached the banks of the Guayabino River, where they were spotted by local fishermen. Sylvia immediately lost consciousness and was evacuated by helicopter. Alejandro was in critical condition and was diagnosed with sepsis, dehydration, loss of a third of his body weight, and fungal skin infections. Only 2 members of the group survived. Later, forensic experts confirmed that Fernando's body had been found in the same area where the group had stopped. He had died of general blood poisoning. Paula was buried on the spot. Camilo Torres was never found. The body of the guide, Esteban Calderon, was also not found. Several circumstances remain unexplained. Why did the GPS navigator run out of power so quickly? It should have lasted up to 10 days. How could Camilo have gone so far without leaving a single mark or trace? Why did Alejandro mention in one of his statements that he heard what sounded like a strange voice whispering from the trees at night, although psychologists attributed this to extreme fatigue and hallucinations? The investigation was completed in March 2016. The official cause of the tragedy was determined to be a navigational error, loss of communication, and bad weather. However, the story of the group of students from Medellin became one of the most famous cases of death in the remote part of the Colombian Amazon. In June 2015, a group of 8 tourists arrived in the department of La Paz, Bolivia, to hike one of the popular trails in the Madidi National Park area. Among the participants was 32-year-old New Zealand citizen Sarah Miller, who had checked into a hotel in La Paz 2 days before the start of the route. According to the guide, she had been traveling in South America for several months, was an experienced tourist, and had independently completed treks in Peru and Ecuador. The route included a 6-day hike deep into the rainforest with overnight stays and campsites. The group was led by 2 local guides, both licensed and knowledgeable about the region. On the 3rd day of the trip, June 14th, near the Alamos Stream, about 20 kilometers from the nearest settlement, the group stopped for lunch. According to the other participants, Sarah walked away from the trail for a few minutes and did not return. 15 minutes later, a search began within sight. The guides and tourists combed the surrounding area, shouting her name and returning several times to the place where she was last seen. After 2 hours, the group canceled the rest of the trip and returned to the day camp. One of the guides went back to the village of San José de Uchupiamon to notify the local authorities and request assistance. The next morning, an official search operation began. During the first 3 days, 6 local police officers, volunteers, and relatives of other tourists were involved in the search. The area was difficult to navigate due to dense vegetation, seasonal streams, and soft ground. The temperature during the day reached 33 degrees Celsius and dropped to 18 degrees at night. Humidity was over 80%. No traces of the tourist were found. There were no signs of a struggle, blood, or clothing at the last known location. No footprints suitable for tracing the route were found either. Over the course of 10 days, a radius of up to 15 kilometers was searched, including possible directions for independent exit. At the same time, stream beds in low-lying areas where a person could theoretically have fallen were checked. On the 14th day, June 28th, the woman's body was found by 3 local guides who had been participating in the search on the bank of the shallow La Palma stream, about 20 kilometers from the place of her disappearance. She was lying face down with her arms outstretched. Her clothes were partially missing. She had no shoes. Her right leg and left arm had closed fractures, and her body had multiple insect bites and traces of plants. Charred wood and a faded cloth bandage were found near the body, probably an attempt to start a fire and bandage the wounds. A later forensic examination in the city of Rurrenabaque established that the woman had been alive for at least 9 days after her disappearance. The cause of death was determined to be dehydration combined with thermal shock and systemic infection. The infection developed due to insect bites and open wounds on her legs, including a broken ankle probably sustained during the fall. Judging by the condition of her kidneys and electrolyte levels, she had severe electrolyte imbalance and acute renal failure in the last 2 days. The route that Sarah Miller took before her death, according to the traces, deserves special attention. According to preliminary estimates, she traveled at least 20 kilometers across rough terrain, including a section with marshy shoals and several small streams. In several places, there were signs that she had crossed the water, using the sound as a guide. Her food apparently consisted of leaves, mushrooms, and the remains of nuts found in the area of her last stop. No traces of dangerous animals were found nearby. What exactly happened in the first hours after her disappearance remains unknown. It is possible that the tourist lost her balance, fell off the trail, was injured, and was unable to return. It is also possible that she tried to find her way to the water on her own, hoping to find her way back. She had no map or compass. Her phone has not been found. After Sarah Miller's body was found, Bolivian investigators, together with representatives of the New Zealand consulate, carried out a series of measures to reconstruct the possible sequence of her actions. An additional on-site examination was organized. The main task was to understand how the tourist could have covered such a long distance alone with multiple injuries, in conditions of limited visibility and without equipment. On the bank of the stream where the body was found, two main landmarks were discovered: a fire pit consisting of half-charred branches and a piece of fabric tied to the nearest tree. Apparently, she had tried to build a fire and create a visual signal. However, the area was difficult to access. Dense trees and high humidity made the smoke almost invisible from the air. A drone used on the 8th day of the search flew within a radius of no more than 5 kilometers from this location, but no heat signal was detected. By that time, the fire had already gone out. A forensic medical examination showed that Sarah was suffering from severe dehydration at the time of her death. Signs of severe heat exhaustion were also noted: dry skin, discoloration of the mucous membranes, and absence of urine. Traces of bacteria characteristic of infection through open wounds were found in the body, presumably as a result of contact with swamp water. Numerous inflamed insect bites were noted on both legs, some with signs of necrosis. Her route was also studied, reconstructed from a series of traces and broken bushes found later. At least 4 stopping points were identified where she probably spent the night: areas with spread branches, trampled foliage, and organic debris. In the area of the third such point, traces of an attempt to build a shelter were found, thin branches tied together with vines. Everything indicated that for at least 5 days she had been consciously trying to keep warm, shelter from the rain, and conserve her strength. Investigators determined that one of the injuries, a broken radius, was the result of a direct fall, judging by the location and angle of the fracture. The leg injury, presumably from a dislocated ankle, occurred earlier. These injuries significantly limited her mobility. However, traces show that she continued to move, taking short runs, probably with long pauses between them. According to investigators, Sarah Miller tried to reach the Beni River, hoping to find shelter along it. However, without a map or landmarks, she lost her way and went deeper into the forest. On the 5th or 6th day, she lost one of her sneakers, judging by the tracks, and continued on barefoot or with one shoe. This accelerated the development of infection due to constant contact with contaminated soil and vegetation. On the 10th day, according to preliminary estimates, the woman was already unable to move. The last place where she was found is located near a stream, but the water in it was stagnant and, according to laboratory tests, contained a high concentration of microorganisms. The lack of a purification filter and the inability to boil water made it dangerous to drink. This may have been one of the key factors that accelerated her death. Local authorities deemed the guide's actions to be adequate. According to them, the group followed standard rules for movement and route following, regularly conducted roll calls, and maintained visual contact. The incident was ruled an accident caused by a combination of disorientation and lack of communication. The guide leading the group said that the tourists had been warned not to stray from the route. However, at the critical moment, the group had neither a satellite phone nor a GPS beacon, which hampered the search operation in the first few hours. A report by the Bolivian Ministry of Tourism from August 2015 states that the incident involving Sarah Miller was the 3rd recorded death of a foreign tourist in the region in the last 6 years. The ministry recommended strengthening the equipment requirements for tourist groups, including the mandatory presence of navigation devices and emergency radio beacons. However, in practice, these measures were implemented irregularly due to weak control. Sarah Miller's family confirmed that she was traveling with a full set of tourist equipment, but left some of it at the hotel before setting off. The reasons for this decision are unknown. Among other things, she did not take a first aid kit, which reduced her chances of providing first aid in case of injury. The police established that she had a mobile phone, but there was no cell phone signal in the area where she was located. The device was not found. Despite the abundance of recorded data, questions remain. Why did the tourist, despite being injured, continue to move away from the trail and toward marshy terrain? Why did none of the searchers find the campfire, even though it was close to the route? Why were no traces of clothing or personal belongings found during the entire search, even though the woman had walked more than 20 kilometers? All these questions remain unanswered. The official conclusion of the investigation is that it was an accident caused by a combination of disorientation, physical injury, and adverse environmental conditions.